Good day guys, us today, and in this one today, we are playing PlayStation 3 games on our PC. Yep, there is an emulator, it's named RPCS3. We've covered it quite a few times on this channel, but today I'm going to take you from start to finish playing not just the games, but we're going to be enhancing them. We're going to be pushing to the limit. We're going to be playing this to the maximum configuration that these games have ever seen. 4K, maximum frame rate, maximum enhancements, maximum everything. Maximus. That's what we're doing today. So without further ado, let's get stuck in. So before we start getting stuck into this then, I do need to give out a gypsy's warning, otherwise I know there'll be tantrums and tears. This is a pretty cutting edge emulator. It's pretty damn new in the grand scheme of things, and the enhancements and the progress that this is making means that you do need a pretty good computer for this to run. It doesn't have to be a rocket ship of a PC, it just needs to be up to a certain kind of standard. I'm talking about i5 and above. I'm talking about possibly Ryzen if you've got it, that works like a dream. I'll put all the specifications on the screen so you can see, minimum and recommended, and I would say that even though it does demand a lot, it's pretty easy to put together a PC that suits this kind of makeup and emulators in general. Pretty soon on the channel I'll be making a build. It should come up to about $300 US, complete PC build that would be suited for these kind of emulators and also for PC gaming, up to a certain kind of standard. Obviously it's 300 bucks, you're not gonna get blistering technology for that, but hopefully that should dry some eyes and should put some of this to rest. As progress obviously develops with the emulator, those requirements will come down and down as performance increases, compatibility increases. That's the journey of an emulator. There is no good emulator straight out the box. It takes a long time to progress to that stage. So enjoy the journey, enjoy this video, and at least by the end of it you will know exactly what your PC can do, what this emulator can do, and the hope for the future. So let's do this. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is actually get the emulator itself set up and ready to rumble. So links in the description down below. It will guide you to this website here, which is the official RPCS3 emulator website. Now to be honest, it's nothing related, but it is probably one of the best websites I've seen for an emulator. It is looking good and there is so much information on here to peruse at your own leisure. Now there is links to the progress site, which is basically what they've been doing and what they want to do for future plans. There's a link to their Discord. It's got a healthy community around it, people helping out, all that kind of stuff, and also there's a link to their GitHub where you can have a look at the code, you can get involved if you're that way inclined, and well, it's open source, anybody can get amongst anything. So what we're going to do is actually get this downloaded. Now at the top of the page there is some various tabs guided to different sections. We're going to focus on download. However, on the splash page there is normally a big download link which is the most recent version, so I'm going to click on that, which will guide me to this. Now at the top normally you've got the most up-to-date version. This emulator is pretty much developed on a daily basis, sometimes more, sometimes they miss a day. It all depends on who's been working on what and what kind of breakthroughs they've been making. Now it is best choice to use the most up-to-date version. That's normally the one that's got the most breakthroughs, the most compatible, and more times I would say the best performance. So click on the link here, it will download the most recent version. As we can see, it doesn't take long. It's a 7-zip format file, which means that you should be using 7-zip to extract it. So because I've already got 7-zip installed on my PC, if I was to click on this, it will open up the window as you can see here. So this is the actual emulator within the compressed file. So what I want to do is extract this to wherever it is that I want to put this emulator. So for this example today, I'm going to put it on my desktop because, well, it's a demo, so I get to show it to you guys. RPCS3, so I'm going to label it, and we're also going to put it as demo so I know which version of the simulator it is that I'm working on. And then I'm going to highlight all these files, and I'm simply going to drag it into that folder that I just created on my desktop, or wherever it is that you've put it on your PC. Once that's done, then exit out of there. We can now see all these files in all their glory within the actual folder. Next, what we need to do is get it so, well, the emulator works. Now, this emulator uses what used to be called like the BIOS files. So in other words, systems or consoles, they would have an operating system on the console itself. This enables it to work well, obviously, so the system actually works, and also gives it access to actually boot games and get them working properly, taking assets from the actual software that's on the system itself. So RPCS3 is no different, but luckily, instead of having to dump them from the consoles or to get them from dodgy websites online, you can actually get it from the official Sony website. So again, links in the description down below. It will guide you to this website here, which is the official Sony PlayStation 3 system software. This is the firmware which basically is on your PlayStation 3. What we're going to do is put this onto the emulator so it acts the same way to get our games working. Simple case, download, update. However, this is quite large, my internet is shocking, so I'm not going to make you sit through here while I download. I'm simply going to cancel, exit out of there, and as we can see, I've already got it downloaded to my desktop. Now, to get this installed, first off, what we're going to need to do is launch the emulator. Now, as you can see, we've got various different files and folders already here. Once I launch this, it's going to make more files and folders as it embeds itself on our system. It's going to make configuration files, it's going to make folders for things to go in, and it's going to set up a profile that we are going to be putting in for, well, our configuration. So, double click it. First thing you're going to see is a little pop-up saying blah 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 blah. To get started, you must install the PlayStation 3 firmware. We've just downloaded that. I'm going to do it now. Please refer to the quick start guide. I'll show you that in just a second. Found on the official website for further information. If you have any further questions, please refer to the frequently asked questions. Again, we'll cover that in just a second. And they've also got support on their forums and Discord. Once that's all that done, click on I've read it. Don't show me again because it's a pain in the ass popping up every time, and then click continue, and that'll be the last you see of that. Now, what we need to do is get our firmware actually on the emulator. So it's a simple case of clicking on file, install firmware, and now what we can do is go to our desktop or wherever it is you downloaded it to, find the PS3 update.pup. That's the file that we just downloaded, and it will now install itself onto the emulator. Now, this emulator needs to change the way that games and software is rendered through the emulator. To put this into layman's terms, it's kind of changes in the language so the emulator knows how to interpret games and software. So what it'll do is it'll do it automatically, but be aware that this will happen. So once I click OK, as we can see, it's now compiling PPU modules. Don't worry about this. It may go slower or faster depending on what kind of system you're running. The more cores you've got, it really starts to speed this all up, but be aware that this will happen when you install new software such as games and all that kind of stuff and you launch them for the first time. This will all be done automatically, but it can be a pain in the ass if you've got big games, because the first time you launch them, you got to get that. Once it's done, then that is it. That's the last you'll see of it. So you can delete your pup file, whatever it is you downloaded it. The emulator is now ready. And if you was to minimize this, as we can see, it's now made all those files and folders that I was talking about and embedded itself on our system. Next thing we're going to do is get our controllers working. So in the configuration tab here, you should have one called pads. Click on that. And as we can see, opens up and we've got gamepad settings for up to 7 players. Depending on what kind of controllers you've got, all that kind of stuff, you can do different configurations, test and play around at your own leisure. But for us, we're just going to get a controller set up so you know how this works. Now, controller wise, you can pretty much play any controller with this emulator. I obviously haven't tested all the ones in the world, but pretty much every controller I've thrown at this, whether it just be a generic Bluetooth, Xbox One S, PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, they all work as long as they're already compatible with your Windows PC. So in other words, you've got whatever firmware is needed to get the actual joystick to show up in Windows. Once all that's done, then I'm using an Xbox One S pad. They're just good to go out the box, so I just need to configure it. So first thing we need to do is turn the actual pad on. So that's me now turned it on. Next thing what I want to do is tell it what pad I want to use. So for me, using an Xbox One S pad, I'm going to use X input. It will automatically assign it a pad number. it goes in basically whatever sequence you plugged in your pads. So for me, the first one that I plugged in would have been 0, so I'm going to leave that as it is. Leave it as default profile. Next thing I want to do is get the configuration. Now at this point, depending on what pad you've put in there, it may differ from the kind of configuration what is on the screen. So take your time, go through all these, D-pad up, left, right, down, and then just go through them all. And then once you've done all that, you should get down to this section here, which is analog dead zones. For those of you who are unaware what this kind of thing is, as you move your actual analog stick, you can see a little blue thing that is mimicking the movement of your stick on the screen. This little red zone here is your dead zone. So any kind of interaction that is moved within that dead zone will not be registered through the emulator itself, only when you go past that red zone. Now that's great because it means that if your sticks are not dead central when they're idling, it means that your player doesn't slowly start walking around and all that kind of good stuff. But you don't want it too big, because then you would have to move your stick all the way to the left or right to get actual movement from your players. So a good idea is to simply do the radius of this red circle so it's close but not touching it, so you've still got a bit of leeway and buffer zone in case your stick doesn't naturally go back to its center position all the time. And the same thing with the other. Once that's done, then click save, and that's your controller set up. Obviously do this for your various different players depending on what controller you've got going on, and once that's done, click OK, and that will now embed itself controller wise onto your system, and you're now pretty much ready to rumble with the games. Now when you're getting your games working, this is going to be the most complicated side of all this, I think, because there is so many different ways of putting them into your emulator. There's so many different formats of games to actually get them working, and they can come in all different shapes, sizes, formats, all kind of stuff, so it can get a little bit confusing, so bear with me here. First off, what I'm going to show you is the most simplest and the most common version of games and how they come to you. These are the more disc-based systems. So these are Blu-rays, obviously, that you would put into your PlayStation 3, and then you would just play the game. However, certain games need installing onto hard drives, certain games need all kinds of settings going on, and we'll cover that in just a second. But Gypsy's warning to you all. This is the RPCS3 emulator, as we talked about. These guys do not condone any kind of piracy. They don't condone any kind of game sharing, anything like that that could delegitimize the actual process of making this emulator. Now, I do know it's 2018. It's a big wide world out there. There is games that you can download off the internet, all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to cover all that stuff in this video. It's up to you to go around them houses. I will not judge anybody doing it however you want. I've traveled this world and I've seen many places, and I know that in some areas in this world you cannot simply just go down to the shop and actually just buy a game. Now, for the games myself and how I get them is from my official PlayStation 3, my actual console. I picked this up secondhand. I've put a custom firmware onto it. I'll put links to a channel in the description down below. He's great at this kind of stuff, putting custom firmware on this kind of thing, and it pretty much transforms your PlayStation 3. It means that whenever you put a PlayStation 3 game into your console, you've got the option to actually play the game, or you can just copy it to an external hard drive that's plugged into your PlayStation 3. So you can have your entire catalog dumped onto your hard drive, so you never need to open up your cases. You've got all games ready to rumble. They're already pre-installed onto the hard drive. There's no messing around. It's just click and play. The great thing is, if you've done that, then you can basically take out your hard drive from your PlayStation 3, bring it to your PC, plug it in, and it's completely compatible with your emulator also. So you get the best of both worlds. But again, you can obviously go onto the internet and do whatever it is that people do. Now, most games will come in that disc format. So here is my drive that I've dumped, and these are all my games. Now, there is different codes, as you can see in front of the games. These codes basically tell you what kind of format that you will likely find from dumping them, or however it is that you get your games. When you go in there, as you can see, you've normally got a PS3 game, PS3 update, and some other files and stuff to go along them lines. Now, this looks pretty intimidating because there's a lot of stuff going on, but you can actually import them into the emulator files themselves. Pain in the ass, don't bother with that kind of stuff. Simplest way to do it is, whatever it is format you've got, highlight whatever games you want to actually bring into your emulator, drag them over, and it should now populate your emulator. Give it a few seconds, there's quite a lot of games there, and there we go. So as you can see now in the emulator itself, I've got all my games that I had from my hard drive now accessible from the same hard drive. It's not moved anywhere, any of the games into the installation folder of the emulator. They're still on that drive, which is the way that I want to keep it, and I would encourage you guys to do the same. Some of these games are absolutely massive, ranging from anywhere between a few megs all the way up to about 50 gigs. They come on Blu-rays, which means that there's quite a lot of storage in there, and some of these games really do take advantage of that. Times that by the amount of games that you've actually got in your collection, and then you've got quite a lot of hard drive space being utilized just from the games alone. Then the emulator itself, the reason why I don't like to put these together is because the emulator does in fact become quite large also. Some of the games that we'll cover in just a second actually install themselves onto the hard drive of the PlayStation 3. So the easiest way to do that would be to install them into the actual emulator itself. Again, we'll cover this in just a second, but just bear all this in mind when you're actually locating your emulator and your games on your PC. You may come into storage issues later down the line. So now we've got the game set up, now we've got the emulator embedded, we're now ready to rock. Let's first off make sure our games are ready to rumble with the settings. At the top here you've got a little tab, click on it, it's configuration, this will open in the settings, and here is everything that will basically put all settings for all games. So this is your default setup now. Now keep everything at default at this stage. There's no need to change anything on this tab, especially because the developers have made everything that is more compatible with the majority of the games as default. So keep all this. Bear in mind, if you scroll over each one, it will give you a translation as to what each one of these settings do in the description down below. But we want to concentrate on the GPU tab. This will open up this, and here is where things do start making an impact quite heavily. So first off, renderer. You've basically got two options. You've got OpenGL and you've got Vulkan. OpenGL is the most compatible and is the most sensible option if you want to basically play the games as they were on the system. However, OpenGL is slow at texture caching. So as you play through the game for the first time, you will end up with quite a lot of stutters and halting, and it's not a pleasant experience. However, if you overcome that, you battle on through, you will notice that it will happen less frequently until it comes to the stage where you get none of that happening at all. However, that is per game. So you do have to play through each game at least a little bit to get it up to a stable kind of standard. OpenGL, albeit very good at rendering all the graphics and making the magic, it's very slow at doing that. On the other side, we've got Vulkan. This is very quick at doing that shader caching. It will still happen, but it is much faster than the OpenGL version. The issue that we've got here is that Vulkan isn't as accurate as OpenGL when rendering the graphics. For some games, shall we say. I'll knock it down to OpenGLs, but for now, let's change to Vulkan. All the rest of the stuff should be kept kind of at normal at this rate. You don't want to be messing around, because we want to make sure the actual emulator is working, then we can start ramping it up. So rest of the settings, standard. Make sure that your console language is set to English. Not that it makes much difference. I don't think that ever done anything to me. Network, emulator, yeah, no need to mess around. There will be differences here depending on what kind of system you're running. I've got 6 cores, 12 threads on my CPU, so I've got 12 here, but you guys may differ as depending on what system you're running from. So once all that's done, then click save, and that will now set up all the games as default. So if I don't make any changes to any game, that's how they will run as standard. So at this stage, what I want to do is actually test the game. So let's load up something that's playable. So we'll go for Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2. Double click it. It will load up this, as we talked about before with the firmware installation. It's just basically the emulator translating the game into a language which the emulator can understand. It will only happen the first time you load each game, and then from that day forth, if you load it up again, it will go straight into the game without any of this. Okay, so now we're in. Let's make the screen bigger. And here we go, we're booted in. At this stage, you won't have this overlay on the screen. This is me to aid me for making sure my, well, system's working to the utmost and the games are working. It's just specs of my system running whilst it's being emulated. So let's skip through all this and get into the actual game. Okay, so now we're in game, and as you can see, it's running pretty damn well. Bottom left hand corner, you can see compiling shaders coming up and down all the time. This will happen the first time you launch each game. Some games will be effective more than others depending on how many shaders it needs to load and store, and if you've played it before and all that kind of stuff. But once you've played through for the first few minutes, it will stable itself out and become pretty damn stable. Stage. Exit out of here. Now let's ramp this up a little bit. So go into right click on the game that you want to do, go into configure. Now what we can do is, by doing it this way, it will change only the settings for this game. So if you've got problematic games, you can do the old compatibility check, see what settings people are working for those, and mimic those settings in your settings here. Obviously, depending on what game is running will dictate what kind of settings you want to be changing. But again, leave most things to standard. The only things that some games do like is the SPU threads. They like this to be brought down, maybe to 2 or 3. Again, it depends on the game. Many of them won't be affected by this kind of thing. It's up to you guys. Also, some people with lesser computers or lesser cores, you can do this lower SPU thread priority. What this will do is kind of tailor the way the game runs to utilizing lesser cores but more gruntage on each core. So again, it will work with some games, may not work with others. It's just kind of ideas and experience that I've picked up from playing with this emulator. Next stage then is the GPU. So as we're running through these games, what you want to be doing is obviously playing them at the best experience possible. A good thing about this emulator is that you can pump up the resolution, and as long as you've got a half decent graphics card, all you need to do is get this dial and pump it up to whatever resolution you want. I'm going to put this up to about 2160, just a bit over I suppose, and that will give me 4K resolution. This will actually override whatever default resolution you've got set over here. Obviously, if you're playing this on a 1080p and you push it to 4K, it's not going to show you 4K images. But what it'll do is it'll give you like a kind of DSR super sampling. So it's rendering the actual game images or the artifacts in that resolution, which means that even if you're playing at a native resolution of 1080p, it will still be a lot crisper on the edges with less jaggies along those lines. But don't let it hamper your performance. Again, the good thing about this emulator is that it hardly impacts whatsoever, so you can pump this pretty high. I wouldn't mess around with this too much unless you've actually got issues with games. What this can do, what I've noticed, is if I pump this up further, then it will take lesser load off my system. But Again, I've noticed big glitches in games doing that, writing not showing up and all that kind of stuff, so I wouldn't mess around with it unless it goes down those lines. Obviously on the side we've got things like VSync and all that kind of stuff. I don't really mess around with anything around here. I keep everything as default unless settings dictate that I have to change stuff. And then you've got frame limiters, you can put it to 30, 60, all that kind of stuff. Anisotropic filtering, post-processing. Again, these can kind of break some games, including the actual frame limit, so keep everything as standard unless you really want to experiment. Rest of the stuff then makes no difference whatsoever with the actual game unless something does need to be done. Click save, and now as you can see, once we've saved that, we've got a per game configuration there, annotated by a little cog next to the icon. This means that if I was to load it now, it would load using its own settings. So let's do that. And this is the emulator now running on these new settings. We are running internal resolution of 4K, albeit being rendered on my screen in 1080p. We talked about why just a second ago, but I trust you, YouTube won't do this justice, but this looks so much better being rendered like this. I will give you now, this is what it did look like. and this is what it now looks like. It's, to me, night and day playing this in real time, but it may differ from you, again, using YouTube's little compression methods. So that, to be honest, is pretty much disk-based systems and getting each game to run. The only other thing that I think we need to cover is getting some of these PlayStation Network games and hard drive-based games working. These are normally come in a PKG format, so let's exit out of here. And here is some PKG files that I've already got set up and ready to rumble. So, as you can see, I've got Wipeout HD Fury, and I've also got Yakuza 5 and Castlevania Symphony of the Night. So some of these come in many parts. So the first one would likely be the initial install of a game. Then you can have the next update, the next update, the next update, all the way until you've got the most recent version. That's why often you'll find that the first file pertaining to said game will be the biggest one, and then they will go smaller and smaller because these are just smaller updates as you go along. Now, the easiest way to actually install these is same as normal, to be honest. Drag it over. Install the package, yes. Now, the difference why we couldn't do it all in once like we did before is because the way that these are done. These are updates. So if I just throw them all there at the same time, the emulator may get confused as to which one is a real file and try to actually install an update before the actual game is there. So to mess around and save any confusion, to make sure everything is installed properly, what I want to do is obviously just drag it over and do one at a time. So as we can see, we've got Castlevania Symphony of the Night now installed on here. Now what I can do is drag this over, and this will now update it, I would think. So let's minimize this. So I've got unknown at the moment, and now this should give us a version, hopefully. No, it's not. But you see where we're coming from. So now if I was to load this up, as you can see, we have now got PlayStation games working. Now this is a PlayStation Network game, so it's not exactly, it is supposed to be emulated, but it's not doing it through the same way as you can emulate through this emulator. That sounds like Inception, doesn't it? Emulating an emulator through an emulator. So now what we can do is play Castlevania Symphony of the Night through a PlayStation 3 emulator. Still kind of Inception, but not as good as doing it through a proper emulator. But there you go. I'm not going to go through it because there's a huge intro to this one. So there you go, guys. That is PKG files, which are normally the PlayStation Network ones. You will see sometimes that you will get a, how would you say, a install file such as this, a PKG, and then you may get an edat/wrap. So some files are called wrap files and some kind of files are called edats. Now what those are is, say for example you was to download a demo of a game. Now some of these demos are actually full games, but you can't access the whole game unless obviously you've paid for it. But if you had paid for them, you will get what's called an edat or a wrap file. Those little tiny files are basically a key to unlock the entire game. So you go through the entire process of installing each one of the games until it's completely up to date. Then you throw in your wrap file or edat, and that will then burst open the game to be fully playable for all time. You get what we're coming from. So I think that is about that, to be honest. We have again gone very in depth. We've covered a lot of stuff on this emulator. Some of the stuff you may think is simple, but for an every user, as in somebody who's never done emulators before, doesn't know what they're getting into, at least now they can take it from start to finish and know everything about this emulator inside out. I encourage you to go over to the RPCS3 website. On there, they've got a wiki for many of the questions which may still burn in your hearts. Also, they've got an active forum like I talked about. They have got an active Discord. And also, I've got my comment section down there. I do keep contact on all my videos and try to answer as many as I can, especially as soon as the video goes up. But if you aren't having any more luck, have a look at my Discord channel. There is a huge community there that don't just cover this emulator, they cover them all. And people have, they've gone far and beyond what is expected of people just helping out. There's nothing in it for them, it's just for the good of the scene. And that's the kind of thing that I love. So if you're a positive kind of person, head on over, join in with the gang, and, well, make it sound like a big party. It's just Discord, for God's sake. But anyway, I'm waffling on. It has been an absolute pleasure bringing this to you guys. Please, as always, like, please subscribe, please share this to everybody in the entire world. But most of all, you guys have a very good day. Laters.